Welcome to the IoT Leaders podcast with me, your host, Nick Earle, CEO of Eseye. And I'm delighted in this episode to introduce Vernon Turner. Hello, Vernon, how are you?
I'm good. Nick, how are you doing?
Yeah, good, thank you. Thanks for being my guest today. And Vernon has got a great career and has started off in programming, financial services, was at IDC, the research company on the East Coast of the US, which is where he is now, for 18 years, ended up as senior research fellow for IDC, and actually headed up the IDC IoT practice, so very relevant to this job. He then went to Cisco for a while, and now runs his own business. So a very broad view and a great contributor to this whole theme of the podcast, which is demystifying it. What's the lessons learned, and how can we act as a guide to people as to how to successfully design and implement IoT projects. So I couldn't think of anyone who has such a broad experience as yourself. I'm setting you up here, Vernon, for some fantastic content. But, let's get going. I said in the intro that you have this varied background. Maybe just to introduce yourself and give some idea to the listeners of the sort of roles that you've done throughout your distinguished career.
Everything has come down to the fact that it's all about the data, whether it's in the financial services and you're trying to figure out, I got $1 billion transaction here, a wire transfer. Did it get from me to you, Nick? Or did it disappear in the network? Did it slow down? Was there latency issues? So really, really complex problems that are hard to scale. When you think of the work at IDC, the whole idea of building an IoT practice is one that we looked at carefully and said, we need to look at every element of the IT stack, from semiconductor to the network into the cloud, because customers are going to build new solutions taking their enterprise infrastructure, and whether they process the applications on the enterprise or in the cloud, they're going to move a lot of that stuff to the edge. And the edge to me is something I've looked at for about 8 years now. At IDC, I felt there was something going on here that I wasn't comfortable with, Nick. I asked CIOs, I said, we're going to build these systems at the edge of the network. We're going to take your applications out of the nice, warm security blanket and put them on the factory floor or on a ship or on an oil well. What are you going to do with that data? And I almost pulled my hair out with the answers. They looked at me and go like, we're just going to keep it. And I said, but how? Where are you going to keep it? What are you going to do with it? And I think, Nick, that's to me is one of the driving forces why I love this so much. It's like, there's so much, quote, unquote, legacy lessons that we have learned from the enterprise that we could easily apply to the edge. And it's this learning curve of bringing everybody along and standing back and saying, have you thought about resiliency? Have you thought about latency? Have you thought about security? Oh, and have you thought about what are you going to do with that data that you wanted to create in the beginning?
And where in the network topology it needs to be, where it's at rest, i.e. stored, where it moves. I agree with you. We'd like to think, wouldn't you, that having learned these lessons with a centralized model, the mainframe, which became decentralized to minis and then very much decentralized with PCs, phones, whatever, that when it came to the edge, the IoT edge, we'd say, oh, well, we know what the model is. But absolutely, an awful lot of people start off with IoT projects and just really don't know what to do with the data or what data they need. And of course, the amount of data collected at the edge is just exponentially bigger, isn't it? Because the nature of the edge, it's not just your employees or your customers. We're now talking your products, things. So the edge is many, many times bigger than everything else added together in terms of possible points where you could collect data, which gives a lot of challenges, doesn't it?
It does. And yeah, whether it's a billion things that will get connected or whatever the number is, it's going to be massive. And I think you framed it really, really well, because traditionally we have had thousands or even maybe hundreds of thousands of endpoints.
Endpoints, yeah. We thought they were the end, but they're actually now midpoints.
Right. So one of the difficulties with any of the IoT projects that I see is that, no disrespect to our teenagers, if we have teenagers, or even people in their 20s, everybody thinks that an IoT project is simply get a sensor and I'm going to connect it. And I stopped them right away and I said, the minute you connect that sensor, are you ready? It's almost like a race. Are you ready to know what to do with that data? And the argument I make about the teenagers is one of our children, when she was 17, 18, she could easily have connected a sensor at home and then either thinking, well, I've done a really cool thing, Dad, the refrigerator door is open, not knowing that she's opened up the whole home to the vulnerabilities of what's out there on the network. The same thing happens on the industrial and commercial side, Nick. I ask customers and clients, I say, have you lost your marbles? I mean, have you understood that the minute you turn this on, do you know what's going to happen to your data? And that's one of our taglines in our company. We talk about, we start your journey with IoT, but quickly connect you to the bigger business outcomes, because I think not knowing what that data can do for you is an issue. So let me give you an example. One of the exercises that I've done to try and justify an IoT project for customers is to stand back and say, how much improvement are you looking for? Are you looking for 10%? Are you looking for 20% improvement on efficiency, reduction of costs, whatever? And you really don't know. And I've shared this exercise with many customers. I said, well, let's take a look at what 1%.
Right.
What would 1% improvement of your business expenses because you're running an IoT application, or a suite of applications?
Yeah. So in other words, if you accept the principle that IoT generally, the use of that data, which as you say is a hard one, but if we could capture that data, if you could use that data, and if that then translated through to a business outcome that saved you just 1% of something that's critical to your company, what could that be worth? That's what you're talking about, right?
There's always the way that says, if you say to somebody, can you save me $1 million? And they'll say, no, but I can find a million ways to save you $1. Right. I mean, it's almost the same argument. What I say is forget the 10%, 20%, because those are big, audacious goals down the road. Let's start with 1%. And in many ways, it opens up their eyes, because if IoT can save them 1% of the factory floor costs, I then ask them, I say, okay, so what was your profit last year? What was your profit in the company? And often the 1% savings in some multinational corporations is easily equal to 10 or even 15% of increased profits or sales to them. Take it a little further on more I'll call it more sustainable. We've seen projects where, and in the UK, for example, I just seen it last week, where the water leakage from the water systems, because we built these, we learned a lot from the Romans how to build, water aquifers and deal with it, but we didn't figure out how to update them since the Roman times.
Yeah.
So they're leaking. All this infrastructure is leaking, and I did the same thing in the US here, and I looked at the amount of water leakage, and I simply said, if there was IoT sensors that could show, predict, and stop the water leakage, what would be the outcome? And Nick, it would equate to 30% of all the domestic usage in the US. 1%.
Vernon, we've talked about this in other podcasts, and the whole point about getting to the business outcome and looking at the payback for IoT is not so much in selling IoT, cool gadgets with smart features. A lot of people think, oh, if I had these features, I could sell more. But that's really not the payback, because as you're pointing out, it's the payback is in the optimization of back-end processes. And in our own part of IoT, we provide ubiquitous connectivity, global cellular connectivity from a single SIM embedded on the board of a device. So it can go to any network and you never have to change the SIM card. But the point about that in relation to the point you just made is, what does that enable you to do? Well, it enables you to create a single product SKU as a manufacturing company that you can just ship all the way around the world, sell through retail, and not have to have an installer or a customer, insert a SIM or change the SIM or anything like that, which means that you actually have fewer SKUs, so you have a single SKU. So for example, Bosch, just as you were speaking, I was thinking of that. Bosch have robotic lawnmowers. We're just talking here as we come into spring in 2021, and they're ramping up their lawnmower production, but they have a single product SKU, and they sell it through retailers in about 50 or 60 countries. It's the same product. That's the point. It's the same product. So and it's IoT enabled, and what that means is their savings on their manufacturing, their supply chain, their warranty process, because they can communicate with the device, and it's always the same device, the same firmware in the device. Those savings are absolutely enormous and absolutely dwarf the revenue actually that they can get from selling more IoT-enabled lawnmowers versus somebody else's IoT-enabled lawnmowers. So I think your point is a good one, is that one of the key things about justifying an IoT project, which you must have got involved a lot in IDC, is actually looking in the right place for the ROI, and the ROI is in the optimization of back-end company processes.
Yeah, so you raise two very important points for me. One is that there has to be a time to value that customers really accept. We've seen these numbers even from Cisco, doing studies, and other companies that would say 80% of all IoT projects fail.
Right.
They don't get out of proof of concept. And the argument there for me is one that when we're scoping out these projects, particularly if you're in the operational technology side, or even any type of business, if it takes too long to implement, if it's too difficult to get the outcome, and this is where I categorize it as the time to value. If customers don't see this implementation very quickly so they can start to reap that benefit, then these projects are almost dead on arrival. And I don't think that's well thought out of, because it goes back to the idea that, well, anybody can do this. Let's just plug it in and see what happens.
Right.
The thing is, the second point is they don't really appreciate the difficulty of the back-end processing that has to be integrated into this.
Yes.
And Nick, you and I have talked about digital transformation and becoming a digital company for many years now. The one thing I look at when I talk to CIOs, I ask, and the question is, you have an IoT strategy and you have a quote unquote digital transformation strategy. Are they connected? Are they in sync with each other? Because IoT strategy will expose the data silos and the lack of transparency that customers are going to want to have when you go down this journey, become a digital company. Because what will happen is you'll create more and more data silos. After all, you and I joked about it. We're going to create data.
Yeah.
Now, for me, the issue that these enterprise systems, the back-end systems, need to play a sort of very underestimated role here. We got to make sure that there is immediate transparency between these divisions in the company, these groups in the company who have the data. And the reason why is very simple. We're going to move from what I call a make and sell concept, where you make a product like the lawnmower and you sell it to you and me, and that's the end of the relationship, to a ecosystem of a sense and response with the customer in the middle. And the customer is going to know real time how well the lawnmower is doing. Is it breaking? Is it broke or is it not? But if it's broken, the repair systems, the supply chain management, predictive maintenance, preventative maintenance, field service engineering, all of that has to come together almost real time. And that's a different experience that customers have. And in your particular case, multiply that onto a global network, onto IoT assets that move around. Those systems have to be in sync with each other. That's, to me, is a fundamental question I ask CIOs. Is straightforward question. If the answer is no, I'm not a very good salesman. I pack up my bag and go, because I'm like, this is going to be a failure project. This is not going to work out.
It's such a tough problem for customers, isn't it? Because every time you delve a bit deeper in IoT, you get more advice from everyone, ourselves, everybody else, everyone saying, well, you need to think about this, you need to think about that. It's sort of like the IoT iceberg. It's actually almost TOI, the top of the iceberg, not IoT. It's the IoT iceberg. It looks great. And, boy, if I could do that would be cool. And then you look underneath, and all those things are under the waterline. And what you're saying is that if you don't fix those and align those to your IoT strategy, you're actually going to create a worse experience for your customers, and they'll hate you for it, and they might never forgive you. They may leave you because just by fixing the bit above the water, but leaving the old processes that are based on doing things in the non-IoT way is actually going to make the problem worse. And you just get all this data, and the customers say, but I've told you that you've got access to it. It's the old phoning the call center, and you got a question, say, oh, I can't answer you. I'll transfer you. So you wait and you listen to some awful music, and then somebody says, hi, hello, can I help you? And he said, yeah, it's about my conversation I've just had. And they say, sorry, what's your name? No, they did brief you when they transferred the call, right? And of course, they're completely siloed. They've implemented a call center, but all the back-end systems are all completely siloed. And what you suddenly realize is there's no common definition of the customer. And so it is a problem that we've been dealing with years, but some people are really getting through it and being successful. And I want to go back and talk about something that you raised earlier on, which we just touched on, but I think listeners would want us to double click on. And that's the issue of security. So let's assume for the moment that you've got a project, you think you know what the 1% is worth. I think we can get $10 million out, and I want approval to spend $100,000 giving it a go. And you've worked out your data model. You know what data stays at the edge, what data has to be backhauled or sent backwards, the metadata perhaps, what data should be stored, what data doesn't get stored. So you've got your model, you've got your plan, and then the CISO, the Chief Information Security Officer, says, hold on a second, I just want to check, are you saying that all these things, these devices, are going to have an IP address, and are they going to be secure? In other words, I hear stories, I don't know, SolarWinds or whatever it is. People hear these stories of devices with, password 1234 or getting hacked. and people tunneling back in, because you've expanded the threat perimeter massively with IoT.
Right.
And there was a big debate in the industry around mobile phones, cell phones, when it was bring your own device, and I said no, you need to have a company device because I need to put security on the device. And people talk about agentless security, the sniffers that sense what's there and then give you security of the devices without you having to put a piece of software on the device. The problem with IoT is that you can't see these devices because they're not wired with an Ethernet cable to your network. They're connecting via a telecom company, say Verizon. Verizon is then connected to MVNO like us. We're then taking that data, we're putting it into the cloud, and we're sending it to the enterprise. So you can't use a sort of network sniffer. But all these devices can, in theory, be compromised. Now, I'm building up to asking you a completely impossible question because we know the industry hasn't solved this. But what is your advice in general, based on your experience, either in your 18 years at IDC, in your Cisco experience, or your new company, Causeway Connections, which we'll come on to? What is your experience and advice, really, is what I'm saying? What is your advice to people about how they go about that? Because you can't ignore it.
No, for a long time, every time at IDC or even my independent surveys, when you ask customers what's the most important fact, or what's the most important inhibitor to doing an IoT project, and the ones that would get it would say security. So there is a mindset that says, yeah. But I think the issue again is there is something about IoT that give people a weird sense of call it security, because they say, well, it didn't cost much. I mean, this sensor was, well, I'll say $100 because I've seen some sensors that are $100. It's still only $100. If I'm a big enterprise customer, it's not a lot of money. Therefore, everything should be okay. I think the argument is they underestimate the damage that can be done with a $100 sensor that's connected to your network. So I think what happens is there's no validation done by customers when they buy the sensor themselves.
Yeah, especially off the shelf products, which we've seen, by the way, in Eseye. We've seen off the shelf products. I won't name the supplier, but we've seen off-the-shelf products that transmit the data to certain countries in the Far East without you knowing it, and they are available on the internet, and they're very very cheap. And there's a reason why. There is firmware, spyware, whatever inside those devices. Yeah.
The second is and we both have some network background. So the idea of creating segmentation in your network infrastructure is fundamentally a table stake for anybody building out an IoT solution. So that, for example, on the factory floor, if you've got a robotic arm, that robotic arm is doing certain tasks. It's collecting data all day long. Now, the question is, who sees that data? And you want to be able to segment or fence that robot in a productive manner that says, if you're, say, Kuko's robotic arm, then anybody that interacts with Kuko's and the robotic arm are the only people that should have access to that data. Once a virus or attack comes in, and if you only have flat networks, then kiss everything goodbye, because your virus is just going to go everywhere. And I think people forget the fundamentals of network security. So it should be segmented. I think, at the sensor, at the gateway, into the cloud, or onto the telco network. But I really, really think this whole idea of spending time to validate the sensor and create this layered approach of security is the only way you can do it. Now, it's a pain, but I'd rather have that pain up front than trying to dig myself out of some ransomware or or how
which by the time you see it, they've probably, whoever they are, and you might never find out, they've probably been in your network for days. By definition, by the time you see it, it's too late. You know, there are some other companies, though, in general, in the world of IoT, there are some companies and some new models that is actually making this easier. Because my point earlier is that you can never catch the ball that's bouncing down the stairs. The IoT ball is exploding exponentially, and we're using linear solutions to try and solve it by trying to put a bit of code on what you're talking about is a good way of doing it, the segmentation. But ultimately, when we get to 20 billion things, we're at 11 today, 50 billion things, 500 billion things. You have to have a different model. I'm very encouraged by what the hyperscale cloud guys are doing, which is the idea of if your data goes to the cloud, the idea of central policy management deployed to the edge. So you set your policy centrally, which is, after all, what we did in the previous waves of innovation. You know, we set the policy in the mainframe. It was easier to control. But then we did, for data centers, you set the policy centrally for virtual data centers, virtual networks, and deploy it automatically to the edge. In just this case, the edge is hundreds of times bigger. But the idea of saying, a simple example, anomaly detection behavior or configuration management process policy, set the policy at the center, and then when any device accesses a DNS address that it shouldn't do. So, this lawnmower should only access these DNS addresses or this APN, or this should only be configured this way. And if anyone changes the configuration, do an alert, quarantine it, flag it, and fix it, and then let it back in. I think, even things like that may not be enough, but certainly I think the lessons that we've learned over the last 10, 15 years as cloud came to the fore is that you have got to use software for this, and you've got to have mass scalability. And often these things are just not capable inside a legacy IT environment inside. Even the largest company, I mean, I'm sure you found that when you were working in the banks in Boston and on the East Coast, that they'd spend a fortune on IT, but it's still hard for them, even with all that budget. Money doesn't solve this problem, is what alone. You need a different way of doing things.
But I think, Nick, if our listeners go away with one thing, and this is me being selfish here, to go away with one thing today, it'd be your comment about security, and it would be this combination of policy and segmentation. And I think the policy one is, again, another undersold attribute that the enterprise guys or the cloud guys have had for years, that customers, again, don't stop and think about, I've now got 10,000 of these things instead of just 50. What am I, how am I going to secure these in a scalable manner that's not going to break the bank by having to deploy so many people to do this, that it has to be done over, on a software model for sure. So thank you for bringing that up.
Well, I think bring it up because everybody mentions it. And for instance, I work with AWS, who are a security certificate issuing authority, or even with Azure, who aren't, but you can access the security certificate separately. They actually, create the security certificate. You can program very simply your policy as a user, even if you're not, because a lot of these people aren't in the IT department. The people who are doing IoT are actually often the people who are in the product department. They're manufacturing the products, or they're the marketing department. So they don't know about it anyway. And so the idea that you can set your policy very easy. If this, then, or it can only do this, and if it does anything else, quarantine, stop, whatever. The idea of the security certificate, goes backwards over the network through the MVNO platform, gets stored inside the SIM itself, the security certificate, and ultimately what will happen with iSIMs, everything is going to get stored inside the silicon. And so the security management is, my contention would be, and many others would be, security is going to be a service provided for us all by companies that are A, global, not regional, and B, have massive scale. And I think the big, large security companies and the hyperscale cloud infrastructures are the best hope we can of not having multiple solar winds or credit card hacks or whatever. I want to make sure that we give you some time to talk about what you're doing now, because after 18 years at IDC, a spell at Cisco, a company I know well, because as you know, I was there for 13 years. You've now got your own company. So Causeway Connections, why don't we tell our listeners what that's all about, Vernon?
Well, thank you. Thank you, Nick. My passion has always been rooted deeply in data and what data can do, both as a business and societal outcome. And what I'm doing right now is helping customers decide where in the business stack do they want to go. Culturally, do they have the right to play in IoT? An example of that is one of my customers is an engineering firm that believes they have the right to move into the medical devices market space.
Right.
And we're in the middle of doing the ROI right now. This time to value, and it's interesting because I think one of the hardest pieces for them to accept is the cultural shift from selling an industrial piece of equipment with a warranty card to becoming a digital company with a 7x24 support center, medical device, and then what happens with that.
That's a big change.
So the answer is, how do we move up the stack? The second one is this idea that if we're not going to move up the stack, or we want to move up the stack, should we look at the adjacencies? Who do we partner with so that 1 + 1 for the customer is actually 3? Because I'm a big proponent of this ecosystem model is going to be the way that customers are going to consume services from us, from you. But my goal here is as purely as the advisor role. Brought in to give the outside-in opinion, and I use that word very, very carefully because opinion is anybody has an opinion. But what I'm trying to do is bank it on, like the pun, bank it on the fact that I've worked in financial institutions that have massive scale, heavy transaction loads, large networks, to this idea that inside IDC, where I became their first research fellow ever in the company on IoT, the idea that understanding from the silicon all the way to the enterprise at the back end is a really, really long journey you need to map out carefully. So I give that outside-in viewpoint.
So you advise clients on their IoT projects.
Yeah. And to be honest with you, I do a lot of it based on quantitative work as opposed to just qualitative. It kind of goes back to the opinion. It kind of goes back to the idea that it's almost what we're talking about now. We should believe in the science of pandemics, what the data scientists are saying. And so my programming background from COBOL, Fortran, assembler, SAS, now R. I would never say I'm a data scientist, but I know enough about data to be able to help our customers make a decision whether this should be a go or no go.
Vernon, from now on, I'm going to think of you as the Dr. Fauci of IoT. But actually,
there's so much fodder.
I know. Well, you got to listen to the science,
Yes, you do.
Yeah. But let's given all of that experience, can you think of an industry? We always like to sort of end the podcast with either who do you think is doing cool stuff or who should we talk to? In your case, I want to ask a different question. IoT, we all know, if it was a baseball game, having lived and worked in the US for many years, I actually think we're at the bottom of the first on IoT. And that'll make sense to our American listeners, and for everybody else, it means in the early stages, very early stages. You ain't seen nothing yet. And one of the challenges is that, if you think about crossing the chasm, and Geoffrey Moore, we're in the innovators, early adopters, we're going to cross the chasm. And when you cross the chasm, there's, the idea of the bowling pin principle. Certain industries are ripe for innovation. They tend to go first. We talked a lot about vending machines, definitely happening vending machines, medical devices, absolutely, for obvious reasons, tracking, telemetry, EV charging. But what else? What other industry do you think, perhaps it might be fragmented, it might be inefficient, but what other industry do you think is ripe for IoT innovation, or what other sector?
So do I have to put a mask on to answer this question?
As long as you don't inject yourself with bleach, I'm fine.
So really, really good question, Nick. And what's fascinating to me is how come no other industry analyst, consultant, advisor has seen this? I'm going to give you a really good opportunity here for our listeners to take a look at the construction industry. We've done a lot. You talk about early movers crossing the chasm. We've talked about smart buildings. We've talked about the whole idea of making the thing green and whatnot, and make it run better. I'm going back and saying, okay, how do we construct these things? And Nick, in the US, playing the numbers game, it's about a $1.3 trillion industry in the US, of which about 700 million is commercial buildings. The rest are domestic, what have you, academic. And the reason why I think this industry is ready for disruption and for innovation is a couple of things have happened. One is there's a natural shortage of skilled workers in this industry. We're not sending our children to trade schools as what we used to do. Two, there's a significant lack of automation in this industry. But the good news is the technology that you and I would follow, whether it be things like IoT, drones, 3D printing. I've actually seen 3D printing in the construction industry that would blow your mind. So what's interesting to me is there's the technology enablers are mature enough to make a business case to an industry that doesn't understand IT particularly well. And go back to the ecosystem. When you're building a large, multi-floor tower block, what it takes to make that thing happen is just enormous amount of data that we don't know enough about. Yeah. And it's not just about the building itself. If you think about
the infrastructure inside the building, like
it's tremendous.
The elevators, the facilities, the company, the facilities management company that manages the building after it's been built. Every single thing will be connected in those buildings.
Absolutely right. So let me give you an example of one of my clients that I did an early engagement with. They build. They have cornered the market for the academic buildings in New England, and they were building a $100 million dorm for a large Ivy school in Boston. And he said to me, they put 15 to 20%, $20 million set aside as contingency, just in case.
Wow.
Weather, bad product, delays, whatever. He goes, if we could predict what that was going to be when we build models into our bids, if we go back to the 1%, if we could just get some...
just get 1% better.
I mean, it would be amazing. So you roll that forward into $600 million business, you can see the saving right away. So the construction industry, Nick, to me is fertile ground for IoT. It's fertile ground for a whole host of innovation accelerators that I think we're going to see because of what I mentioned, automation, skill shortages, expense.
A great example. And I'm sure that that is absolutely going to come true and be the case. A very fragmented industry that has an opportunity to reinvent itself around data, the use of data. So, Vernon, just before I wrap up, and this has been great, thank you very much. I think we could have probably made this a 3 times longer podcast, but everyone would. I don't think that's what people would want us to do, at least in one episode. If people do want to get in touch with you, how do they get in touch with you?
Oh, easy. There's 3 ways. One, I'm always on LinkedIn. You and I are always having banter on LinkedIn. 2, I try to be sincere on Twitter. I'm not just a trash talker on Twitter.
I knew I was doing something wrong.
Yeah, and of course, you can email me at vernon@causewayconnections.com.
Causewayconnections.com. Great. All right. Well, listen. Let's see it there. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I certainly did, and thank you to my guest, Vernon Turner. This is the IoT Leaders podcast, where we try and bring you people, one guest per show that has got experience in different parts of IoT, and certainly that was the case today. Now, if you want to get in touch with us, then it's also simple. The best way is to send an email to iotleaders@eseye.com, and you can just give us feedback. Or you could say, look, I think this is a subject we want you to go into. As you found out today, Vernon and I just went into subjects as the conversation flowed, and we're very, very happy to do that. You may even say, I really think this person would be interesting to be on the show, or maybe you want to be on the show. So please get in touch. But in the meantime, thank you for listening, and thank you again to my host, Vernon Turner. Cheers. Thanks, Vernon.